So today's topic is secondary motions. And I have to apologize in advance. This is probably the hardest of the 5 classes to comprehend, just because there are meanings behind these different types of motions that took me forever to wrap my head around. And so the great thing about this class and the way we set it up is that it's being recorded, and if something does not make sense, hopefully you can go back and review the recording, and after hearing it a couple more times, it'll become more clear. I was kind of on my own when I was understanding this. So to go back to the fundamental principles of parliamentary law, there is this principle that only one question can be considered at a time. Once a motion is before the assembly, it must be adopted or rejected by a vote, or the assembly must take action disposing of the question in some other way before any other business, except certain matters called privileged questions, may be introduced. And the reason why we're reviewing this is because what we're talking about are secondary motions, and and so it kind of sounds like it's in opposition to this idea, but it's actually not. Going back to the types of motions that we made during meetings, there's 2 main piles of motions. There's main motions, and then there's secondary motions. And the main motions are the ones that I just referred to, where only one can be before the assembly at a point in time. So an original main motion was what we discussed in the very first class, where someone makes a motion to do something like, I move that we buy a red pickup truck for the delivery of food to seniors, or whatever it is. Those are main motions that bring business before the assembly. Incidental main motions are a class of incidental motions that can be introduced when nothing else is on the floor. And those are the ones that we'll be talking about today. But if they are introduced independently when nothing else is on the floor, they're handled a little bit differently than if they are introduced when there is business under consideration. So there's a slightly different set of rules that apply. If they are introduced when nothing else is on the floor, then they generally follow the same rules as a regular motion, which is, that it has to be seconded, it can be debated, and it can be amended, and then voted upon. So then we get to the class of secondary motions. And these are called secondary motions because they can be introduced while there's a main motion on the floor. And the reasons why that's okay, we'll get to in just a minute. So there's 4 classes of these. There's subsidiary motions, privileged motions, incidental motions, and then a final category called bring back motions. And don't worry about these. We're going to go through definitions of each one of these in the class. And just one more thing about this material. The main purpose of going through all of these things, because if you're a presiding officer, the last thing you want to do is for someone to make a secondary motion from the floor, and you are not aware of what it means. Because then you're up there looking like a deer in the headlights, and you don't know how to handle it. And then hopefully you have a parliamentarian who can refresh your memory or inform you for the first time. But the purpose of going through all of these is to expose you to them, not without the expectation that you're going to remember everything, but if some of these come up, you can say, oh yeah, that's right. That motion requires, is not debatable and requires a 2/3 vote, and you can proceed with handling it as you should. And you can always look it up in the book. So the correct definition of a secondary motion is it's one whose relationship to the main question or whose procedural characteristic or agency is such that, 1, it can be made and considered while a main motion is pending without violating the principle of taking up only one question at a time. And two, when the secondary motion has been made and has been admitted by the chair as in order, that is, being legitimately able to come before the assembly at the time according to the rules affecting its use, it must be acted upon or disposed of before direct consideration of the main question can be continued. There's the concept of precedence with some of these motions. So there are certain secondary motions that also take precedence over others, so that it is possible for more than one secondary motion to be pending at a time, together with the main motion. In such case, the motion most recently stated by the chair among those that have been voted upon, have not been voted on, is the immediately pending question. So you can envision this kind of as a stack. So someone's made a main motion, and then someone else has made a secondary motion, and then someone else has made an additional secondary motion. You deal with the top of the stack and work your way back to the main motion if you get motions that stack up. And yes, this is complicated to handle in a meeting, and and the only solution to that is practice. If I'm in a situation like this, I have a pad of paper in front of me where I write down motions if things start to get complicated, so that I'm actually handling things properly, because I can't remember these things and preside at the same time. It's just too much to do. So reviewing the original main motion, which is what we reviewed in the first class, a main motion is a motion whose introduction brings business before the assembly. And a main motion can only be made when there's no other motion pending, and it ranks lowest in the order of precedence of motions. So example is, I move that the organization lease office space at 123 South Main Street. Incidental main motions corresponding to subsidiary motions. So this is where it gets a little bit ambiguous, just because the language starts sounding the same. For each of the subsidiary motions, amend, commit, postpone definitely, and to limit or extend limits of debate, there is a corresponding incidental main motion of the same name that can be made when no other motion is pending. So incidental main motions corresponding to privileged motions, for the motions to recess, to adjourn, and to fix the time to which to adjourn, there are corresponding incidental main motions of the same names. So you can move to adjourn the meeting if there's nothing else on the floor. You can also move to adjourn the meeting when there's a motion under debate. At such times, incidental main motions are moved in disposition just as any main motion. So this might sound confusing, but as we go through the definitions and examples of these, hopefully it'll become more clear. An incidental motion as a class deal with questions of procedure arising out of another pending motion. And an incidental motion is said to be incidental to the other motions or matters out of which it arises. And with but a few exceptions, incidental motions are related to the main question in such a way that they must be decided immediately before business can continue. So an example of this is, I move to consider by paragraph. And the reason why we have all of these tools in the parliamentary toolkit is because over time, people have realized that sometimes it's necessary to give members in an assembly these various parliamentary tools in order that the will of the majority be followed. And so that's kind of a checks and balances system with the presiding officer. So the presiding officer is doing their best to run things, but if something should be done differently, you as a member of the assembly can make these motions, and as a either a majority or in other cases a 2/3 majority can decide to do something different. And just to review, an incidental motion are related to the main question in such a way that they must be decided upon immediately before a business can proceed, and most incidental motions are undebatable. So what we will see as we go through these is that there's characteristics for the incidental motions that you have to be aware of, because depending on the nature of the motion, they can vary. And so examples of incidental motions are point of order, which is to raise a point of order that you think something should be done differently, or you're questioning something. And then also the motion to suspend the rules, which is a really cool one, when you want to do something different than what your standing or special rules allow for. And another way to think about subsidiary motions is that they assist the assembly in the treating or disposing of the main motion. So someone could move to limit debate to 5 minutes, and if by a 2/3 vote, the assembly agrees to do this, then that's what you do. It's not an infinite amount of time that can be allocated to the debate. And the privileged motions are a subset of the full set of motions that can be made. They do not relate to the pending business, but have to do with special matters of immediate and overwhelming importance, which, without debate, should be allowed to interrupt the consideration of anything else. An example of this is I move the agenda. We talked about this at the last meeting. So if you find the meeting has gone off track and people are debating something that is not on the agenda, you as a member of the assembly can say, I move the agenda, and it really compels the presiding officer to end the current discussion, which is off track, and bring the assembly back to what is supposed to be under consideration of the agenda. And the great thing about this one is it does not require a second. It is not debatable, and it has to be acted upon immediately. So it's actually one of the most powerful motions that a member can make, because you can make it by yourself and it has to be followed. The final class are motions that bring a question again before the assembly. And these allow the assembly to consider again the merits of the question that has been previously disposed of in some way. Excuse me. All of the motions that bring a question again before the assembly are usually made while business is pending. And example of these are to take from the table, and another one is to amend something previously adopted. So you adopted something at the previous meeting, you think that it could be improved upon, and so you can move to amend something previously adopted. Doesn't mean the assembly is going to agree to it, but you can bring this up for consideration. So the first group we're going to talk about are the ranked motions in order of precedence of the privileged motions. And these 13 motions go from the highest ranking to the lowest ranking. And what that means is something that is higher in rank can be moved and dealt with before something of a lower order. Now, the first two are also have language that is kind of ambiguous and redundant, and also was very difficult for me to wrap my head around. So if I'm not clear, by all means, please ask and I will try again. It is possible to, when the current meeting adjourns, that you reconvene the meeting at a future point in time so that it is a continuation of the current meeting. And that is done by fixing the time to which to adjourn, which means that you're adjourning. When you adjourn the current meeting, you reconvene at a fixed time in the future. So an example of this is I move that when this meeting adjourns, we reconvene Saturday at 10 a.m. And the characteristics of this one is it may not interrupt, so you have to be recognized to make this motion. It does require a second. It is not debatable, but it is amendable to the extent of when you reconvene. So you might move that you reconvene at 10 a.m. on Saturday, but everyone knows that the big football game is happening on Saturday, and so someone else says, I move that we amend the motion to reconvene at 10 o'clock on Sunday. But it's not debatable, and so the presiding officer immediately puts these to a vote to figure out what the assembly wants to do. And for this one, it's just a majority required to pass. And because these are privileged motions and they are secondary, they can be made at any time. So if you are debating the acquisition of a red truck, someone can raise their hand and they can say, I move that when this meeting adjourns, that we reconvene Saturday morning, because they've already understood that, that we've only gotten halfway through the agenda and we're not going to get through everything. And so they're suggesting that we set aside time so that we can finish the business that has been brought before the assembly. The next one is to adjourn, and this is to adjourn the meeting. So it is possible to be debating a motion on the floor and someone says, I move to adjourn the meeting. And it is, again, not interruptible. It does require a second. It's not debatable, and it is not amendable because either you adjourn or you don't. And it just requires a majority. So if a majority wants to adjourn the meeting, they have the right to do so. And so this is where you can understand maybe the principle of precedence when that comes into play, because when someone says they move to adjourn, someone else can raise their hand, and before the meeting is adjourned, they could be recognized. And they can say, I move that we reconvene at 10 a.m. on Saturday morning. And so that is the highest ranking motion that takes precedence over everything else, including adjourning. So the chair has to recognize you. You can make that motion. And then if the majority wishes to reconvene, then they can do so. The third ranking privilege motion is to recess. And this is if you've been sitting in a meeting for 2 hours and you need to stand up and stretch your legs because you're starting to go crazy. You can raise your hand and say, I move that we recess for 10 minutes. Again, cannot interrupt, does require a second. So at least 2 people have to think it's a good idea to recess. It is not debatable. It is amendable to the duration of the recess, and it just requires a majority vote. So if you raise a motion to recess in the middle of a motion, and then the debate or whatever is going on halts, you recess, and then when you reconvene, you pick up where you left off. The next one is one that is sometimes incorrectly phrased. There is no motion under Robert's Rules of Order called a point of personal privilege. Everyone is equal, and so no one, like a former chair or former president, doesn't have a right to personal privilege that anyone else doesn't have. However, the fourth ranking motion to raise a question of privilege means that there is something going on that needs to be corrected for the meeting to continue properly. And so perhaps the temperature of the room has risen to 95 degrees. And so you can raise your hand, and it is interruptible. And you say, Madam Chair, I raise a question of personal privilege. It does not require a second. It's not debatable, and it's not amendable. And then you raise your point, which is, I believe the temperature is 95 degrees, and we really need to open the windows, or whatever needs to be done regarding the conduct of the meeting in order to proceed properly. And then the chair decides if it's appropriate or not. The fifth one is the one that we talked about last time, which is to call for the orders of the day, and is the way to bring a meeting back to what you agreed to on the agenda. So you've noticed that, as I said previously, it is interruptible, it does not require a second, it is not debatable, and it is not amendable, and it must be done at the request of any one member. So that's, you don't have to sit there and endure a meeting that has gone off track. You have the right as a member to call for the orders of the day and get the meeting back on track. The next one is to lay on the table. And the reason why this one is named that, I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the House of Commons in the UK, where they have the bleachers on both sides, and then they have the big long table, and then the speaker at the end. And so this is where this motion comes from. All the bills are written on paper, and so what the presiding officer is dealing with the motion that's written down. And so someone moves to lay it on the table. That really refers to taking that piece of paper, which contains the motion under consideration, and setting it aside for consideration later in the meeting. And this is a great thing to do if there's something else coming up that really needs to be discussed. You know, say the governor is coming to speak to your group, and the governor is on a tight schedule and has arrived a half an hour early. And so someone can move to lay the current item on the table in order for the governor to speak. And if it receives a second and a majority vote, then that's what happens. And then to bring something off the table is a separate motion, and it's under the bring back motions. But that's how you then take something off the table and bring it back to complete the debate on it. The next one is called previous question, and this is the most abused motion in the book, in my experience. The question it's referring to is, you know, what do you want to do with the current motion that's being under consideration? You've probably seen people shout out question, or I call the question in meetings. And the way this is mishandled is that the chair says the question has been called, debate will end, and we will now go to a vote. To call the previous question is a limitation on the rights of members to debate something. It really means that you're ending debate and moving to a vote on the pending motion. And so to do so, it requires a 2/3 vote. And so the proper way in which this one is handled is that someone raises their hand, they have to be recognized by the chair, and they say, I move the previous question. It has to be seconded. It is not debatable and it's not amendable, and it requires a 2/3 vote. And so what the chair should do is say, the question has been called, and if this motion passes, we will end debate. All those in favor of the previous question, or all those in favor of ending debate, please raise your hands. And then the hands are counted. All those opposed, please raise your hands. And then if it receives a 2/3 vote, then the debate ends, and then you move to a vote of the pending question, and then that ends. This is useful when like the debate is getting redundant, and you've got 50 people in the room, and 10 people have already repeated the same arguments, and if you're a member, sense that people are getting a little tired of this, even though this one group of people are very passionate about it, you can say, I move the previous question, and end the debate. And you can do this if 2/3 of the people agree. If 2/3 don't, then everyone retains their right to debate. And then the only limit is that they either have the default limits in the parliamentary authority, which is they can't speak more than twice on a topic for more than 10 minutes. Or if you have special rules that further refine that, like you can only speak for 3 minutes, then those apply. The next one is to limit or extend limits of debate. And this is a great one if you find yourself with meetings that go on too long. You might start putting a limit on debate if that's what the assembly agrees to. And you can do this in a couple of ways. You can do this by putting times on the agenda by which things have to start and end. Or someone can say, I move to limit all debate to 10 minutes. And if you do this, like at the beginning of the meeting when nothing is pending, then this is an incidental main motion, and it applies to the rest of the meeting. So someone could say, I move to limit all debate this afternoon to 10 minutes on each topic. And because this is a limit on people's rights to debate, it takes a 2/3 vote. It is amendable because someone can say, I move to strike 10 minutes and make it 15 minutes or whatever they want. But that is the only thing that you can really amend in this motion. It is not debatable, so you don't spend a lot of time debating this. And it does require a second. The next one is to postpone to a certain time. So say that there's a discussion on a topic and there's some key members who really need to be a part of the discussion, or for whatever reason, someone can say, I move to postpone the debate on this topic to the March meeting. And you can see that, again, it's not interruptible. It does require a second. It is debatable. So this is one where you say, no, I really think we need to decide this today and continue debate. And then you can amend it. And it just requires a majority in order to pass. But you can see that it's really the will of the majority in the room that gets to make a lot of these decisions about how things are handled. It's not up to the chair. If the chair senses that something could be done more efficiently or to help people along, and perhaps they're not familiar with all of these things, the chair is always welcome to suggest things like, the chair would entertain a motion to postpone the current topic to the next meeting so the treasurer can be here with with our accurate checking account balance or whatever. The chair can always suggest these things, but again, these motions have to come from the membership. The next one is to commit or refer, and this is about referring things to a committee. So you remember earlier we said that most of the work inside these organizations are done with committees, and the committees bring work before the assembly for a decision on what to do about the recommendations from the committee. If you have a motion that says, for instance, I move that we have a social function every quarter. Someone can say, well, I move to refer this item to the entertainment committee or whatever appropriate committee you might refer it to, and assign this task to them so they can go off and work on it. And you don't bog the meeting down with a bunch of minutia that really should be handled offline. Lots of meetings get bogged down because the meetings try to do actual work instead of just making decisions, do actual work in the meeting, which sometimes can get too complicated to handle. And really those kinds of things work much better into smaller groups of people who can think through issues and then bring back the proposals to the greater group to consider. And they have the right to amend it or whatever they want to do. But someone's put some thought into something before it's brought to the main assembly, just in the concerns for efficiency. The next, or the third to the last, is the motion to amend. We talked about this in the first meeting. So if someone moves a motion, it is the right of any member of the assembly to amend it to say something else if it's germane. So someone says, I move to purchase a red truck for the transport of meals, and someone say, I move to amend the motion by striking red and then inserting blue. So any of the verbiage in a motion can be amended, and you can see that this is a very low-ranking motion. So all of the subsidiary motions above it can be applied to it. So if you amend something, then someone else can commit or refer that to a committee, and then someone else can say, well, I'll postpone this to a certain time. And then all of those motions kind of stack up, and then they're dealt with in sequence until the motion is disposed of. You could postpone something indefinitely, and there's some special rules around this one, but perhaps it's a topic that is really going to be just too destructive to discuss in the meeting. And so before debate happens, someone says, I move to postpone indefinitely consideration of the purchase of a red truck. And it does require a second. It is debatable to the merits of postponing it or not the merits of the question. And it just requires a majority. And then the lowest ranking order is the main motion. So when nothing is on the floor, someone can make a main motion or any of the incidental motions that then would be handled as a main motion. So those are the 13 ranking motions. And hopefully you've got a parliamentarian to help the presiding officer in working through these things if you have an assembly that brings up a lot of this stuff and really gets into it. Most people are unaware of their rights to make these motions, and so often you don't really see these used inside meetings. But again, it is there if you are operating under Robert's Rules of Order. Any member has the right to use any of these motions, and you as the presiding officer should be able to handle them fairly. Then in addition to the privilege motions are what is called non-ranking motions. And these are all defined in the back of Robert's Rules of Order and set a really long table. And again, these are motions that we made from the floor that are incidental to the main motion. And what I'm going to do is talk about what each one of these means, just so you're familiar with them. There's no expectation that you remember all the characteristics of these, but at least you can, you're familiar with it. I have among the material distributed with the class a Google Doc, which has all of the motions, including the incidental motions and the ranking motions and all these characteristics, exactly as you see this here. And when I'm in a meeting, I always pull up that like on my iPad or something. And then, if there's something that I want to make sure that I get it right, and I can easily look it up, and you all should have access to this document for your use. The first one is to appeal the ruling of the chair, and it's one of the most dramatic motions in the book, and we'll talk about the process to appeal in the fifth class. But this is when the chair has made a ruling and there's something that's ambiguous and you disagree with it. You can appeal the ruling of the chair. So this again is a way in which the power of the chair can be checked by the assembly. It is interruptible. So someone can say, I appeal the ruling of the chair. You've got something in the bylaws that's ambiguous and they've made a ruling on what they think the interpretation is. And if you think it's something else, then you can interrupt and say, I appeal the ruling of the chair. Does require a second, so someone else in the room has to agree with you. It's got special rules of debate, so this doesn't drag on endlessly. And the rules are that the chair gets to first make a statement about why they made the ruling that they did. Everyone in the assembly has the right to speak once. It is not amendable. And then at the end, the chair can make a final explanation. Maybe they've changed their mind and they've reversed their decision, or they're still sticking adamantly to their initial ruling. And then they take a vote, and by a majority vote, you can reverse a ruling of the chair in an area that is open for interpretation. Now, what you cannot appeal are things like in the bylaws that are flat out clear on their meaning. If you have a chair or a presiding officer who is going against the rules, then that's handled in a different way. So this is really when there's an area of ambiguity and you then move it to the assembly to decide and possibly overrule the chair. And the chair shouldn't get offended because they've done this. The chair is just doing their best effort, and if the majority of the assembly disagree and think it should be something else, then great. It's the assembly's right to do so. The chair can also move questions to the assembly, so they don't even get involved in the decision. So if it is an area of ambiguity, the chair can say, hey, all those who believe that this means, blah, 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 please raise your hand, and then let the assembly at the get-go interpret the bylaws, and then you don't even have to get to an area where the chair makes a decision like this. The next one is to close nominations. So someone can move to close nominations. Usually what happens is that, you just let nominations come and go, but it is a good idea to close nominations so you have a clear definition between when names can be taken for nomination and when they can no longer be taken. So if someone, if 10 people have been nominated and someone thinks it's too many, they can say, I move to close nominations. If it's not debatable, and if 2/3 think that they should be closed, then you close nominations. It's 2/3 because it's taking away the right of a member to nominate. So usually when something requires a 2/3 vote, it is something to do with curtailing the rights of the membership. Otherwise, it's generally a majority. That's a pretty easy way of remembering what the vote requirement is. Someone can move to consider by paragraph. So say you have a motion before the assembly that has 5 paragraphs in it. If it's not controversial, maybe you just proceed with it as it is. If you consider by paragraph, then what happens is that the chair then focuses on each paragraph, and debate is handled on that paragraph, and then they go to the next paragraph. And it's a more structured way of working through something if it's very complicated. And usually this is a good thing to do if you are amending the bylaws and where every word is important. And so once the document has been gone through by paragraph, then the chair takes the final vote on the entire document to pass it. Members can also amend paragraphs when you're considering it, which is what in Robert's rules they call perfecting. The next one is to create a blank, and we will talk and go through an example of creating a blank. This is a great motion for considering several options and coming up with a solution which the majority will probably accept, so you don't get a bunch of discussion about something and a number of attempts to make a motion to do something, and then people just give up because they are tired of the Robert's rulesy way in which things are being conducted. So creating a blank is a way of considering several options and coming up with one which the majority feels comfortable with. Division of a question. This is when someone has introduced a motion where the parts could be considered and they're not codependent. So someone can say, I move to divide the division of the question, and that really breaks it into 2 separate motions that are considered separately if it can be divided. Division of the assembly is the motion that someone makes when you need to have the vote verified. So perhaps the voice vote was too close and you disagree with the chair that the ayes have it or the noes have it. You can call for division of the assembly and get a counted vote so that everyone understands whether something passes or fails. You can move to object to the consideration of a question. There is no second required. It's not debatable and it's not amendable. And 2/3, it requires a 2/3 vote. Again, this is when you want to just completely object to something, and this has to be made when it's introduced and before it undergoes debate. The next couple are very handy tools for members to use. So the first one is a parliamentary inquiry. That's so that your membership does not have to remember everything about Robert's Rules of Order in order to do something. If they need to know the proper procedure to do something, they can raise their hand and say, Madam Chair or Mr. Chair, I have a parliamentary inquiry. It does not require a second. It may interrupt. It is not debatable and it's not amendable. So it's every member's right to understand the rules under which they're operating. So someone can raise their hand and say, I wish to please explain the process under which I appeal a ruling of the chair. And then the chair will respond with an answer to that question. The next one is a point of order. And this is if you, as a member, believe that something is being done improperly. So say that the chair has appointed non-members of the assembly to a committee, for example. And if this is not allowed for in the bylaws, and it's certainly not allowed for in the parliamentary authority, you can say, point of order, I believe that you have appointed non-members to the special committee to decide on social functions for the year. And then the chair does a ruling on whether the point is well taken or not. So the chair will say, oh, you're absolutely correct. I do need authorization for the membership to appoint non-members to the committee and then handle it from there. Or they can say, no, actually, all of them members or all of the people I appointed were members, and it's just you just don't understand that the people who you think are not members became members in the interim, or whatever the question is. Point of order is how you bring something before the assembly that you think is incorrect, and this is how you, for instance, would contest a election. So you could say, point of order, I believe that that ballots were distributed to non-voting members and we need to redo the election, or whatever you think as a member that has been done improperly. There's a motion to reopen nominations. So perhaps you've taken 10 nominations and the assembly has voted to close nominations, but you feel that another person really should be put into the mix. You can move to reopen nominations, and if a majority agrees, then you do so. Request for information is a broader question than the parliamentary inquiry. So, perhaps you need to know the balance in the treasury of liquid funds in order to do something. You can say, you can raise your hand and it's interruptible. Would someone please refresh the assembly's memory on how much money we have in our checking account, or whatever the question is. So whatever your request for information is, the chair has to respond to it. Because one of the things that you want to have when you debate something is all the information so that you make a correct vote. The next one is a request permission to withdraw a motion. And if you remember, we discussed this also at the first one. After a motion has been seconded and stated by the chair, it no longer belongs to the maker of the motion belongs to the assembly. So say that you have made a motion to spend all the money in the checking account on a vacation for the officers, and it's under debate, and you realize that that's not a good idea. You can request permission to withdraw the motion, but it's up to a majority of the membership if you can withdraw the motion. Perhaps you after consideration, you've decided it's not a good idea, but the assembly thinks it is a good idea, then the assembly can still continue on with it. The next one is my new favorite rule, which is to suspend the rules. So anything that is in the standing rules or the special rules can be suspended. And that's because you have standing rules to put processes in order to handle some things, like you might have standing rules for elections or whatever is important that you have standing rules for. If you want to do something different, it's always the right of the assembly to do something else. And so someone can move to suspend the rules and do something contrary to what the standing rules say. And by a 2/3 vote, you can decide to do so. Does require a second. It's not debatable, it's not amendable. So you don't really get an opportunity to explain why you want to do this. And the suspend the rules is an interesting motion because it's kind of a twofer. So you can say, like, I move to suspend the rules and do something, and then you don't have to state the exact rule that's being suspended. There's an assumption that people understand what it is, and then if they vote on it, then either it's an up or down vote on what they want to do that's contrary to the rules.
So the next one was to discharge a committee. Made interrupt no. Is a second required? Yes. Is it debatable? Yes. Is it amendable? Yes. What vote is required is the asterisk, and can it be reconsidered asterisk?
So the reason why this is a bring back motion is because you've referred something to a committee and perhaps the committee has been in a logjam and they're unable to come up with a solution. And so you can discharge a committee and bring back that work that has been assigned to them into the assembly to do something else with. So maybe you want to reassign it to a new committee, or you want, however you want to handle it. That's why it's a bring back motion.
Okay, and the next on that list was reconsider. So we said a second is required. It's debatable. It's not amendable. The majority vote is required, and it cannot be reconsidered.
Yes, if you want to reconsider something previously decided, then this is the motion that you use to bring that before the assembly to do something else.
Okay. The third one was to rescind or amend something previously adopted.
So rescind means to reverse, and then to amend is to change it. And so this is how you, again, bring something back before the assembly. And the difference between this and the other one, I recommend you just going through the book to see the differences between the two.
And the last one is to take from the table.
And this is when you have put something on a table and you believe that that it's time to finish off that piece of business. So say that you have put something on the table and that say the governor shows up and the governor leaves, and then you want to bring that back. So at any point during the current meeting or during the subsequent meeting, you can bring something off the table. This is not the tool. So to put something on the table is not the proper way to kill a motion. But if you don't consider it by the end of the subsequent session, then that item goes away, and it has to be made as a new motion to be brought before the assembly.
Okay. And we did have a few questions in the chat box, and I do apologize if you already answered. I was pulled away for a fire drill, so I do apologize if it's a duplication. If there is nothing else on the floor, doesn't the incidental become a main motion?
There's nothing on the floor. Yes, that's the definition of an incidental main motion. So if it's an incidental motion and it's made with nothing else is on the table, it's handled like a main motion and follows the same rules as a regular main motion.
Okay. And could you give an example of motions that stack up?
What does that mean?
Dorothy, can you please elaborate? You could either type it in the chat box or unmute yourself. The next question. Oh, thank you.
Okay. So it was earlier in the presentation when an example was given of stacking motions. I found that very confusing.
So
maybe just give an example what stacking motions would be.
So the usual motion that comes on top of a main motion is to amend it. So at the lowest ranking motion is I move to do something. Someone else says I move to amend it. And so you've got the motion to amend sitting on top of the main motion. So that's like your first layer. And then someone says I move to refer this motion to a committee. And so that's like your third motion. And so the chair will take a motion to refer this to a committee. And if it's referred to a committee, for instance, then the whole package then goes off to the committee in its current state to finish off.
Okay.
If the assembly side decides not to refer it to a committee, then they vote that motion down, and then you go back to the amendment, and then you either pass the amendment or not pass the amendment, and then after that's dispositioned, then you go back to the main motion for consideration. So that's how these things get stacked up.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Are there limits on how many times a person can call the question? For example, can the chair refuse the motion to call the question if the person has unsuccessfully attempted to end debate once or twice already?
This is up to the discretion of the chair. And, if the chair gets too egregious, then the assembly can replace the chair. But, people cannot be dilatory in their use of motions. They can't make motions like this to really disrupt the business just because they have the right to make them. And so the chair can, if someone's called the question, twice, and the assembly has decided to vote that motion down and continue on with debate, it's clear what the assembly wants to do. Usually you as presiding officer have the sense of what's going on. And if you sense that that they want to go on and someone has called the question twice, you can say, that I'm going to rule that as an invalid motion. The assembly has already decided that it wants to finish debate on this, so it's not a valid motion. So the chair has a little bit of discretion, but again, and this is where it gets very Robert's Rules-y. Someone can say, I can appeal the ruling of the chair. I believe that my motion to call the question should be considered. And so then that's an alternate way for the assembly to say, yes, we want to stop and move on or not.
Thank you. Can the presiding officer make a motion?
No, the presiding officer can suggest motions to be made by the assembly, but the presiding officer can't make a motion themselves. That's why they use the language, the chair will entertain a motion to do such and such. And then someone has to say, and I've had this happen to me where, the chair entertains a motion to, do blah, blah, blah. No one does. And that means the assembly doesn't want to do it. And so then you just move on.